I have witnessed the fall of stars. I have stood in the ashlight of dying suns and watched fleets larger than moons come apart like wet paper. None of it prepared me for a quiet man in gray standing very still behind a chair. My name is Asenval. I keep the records for the Third Concordance, which is a polite way of saying I am the one who writes down what happened after the powerful people have finished pretending it didn't. And what I am about to tell you happened in the Hall of Nine Waters, on the day the council learned a lesson they had spent 400 years earning. Let me start where it began, not with the shouting, with the waiting. The hall sits at the top of the meridian spire, so high that the weather happens beneath you. That morning there were storm clouds moving across the lower districts, and from the great curved windows you could look down and watch lightning walk between the towers like something alive. The air inside smelled of cold metal and the faint sweetness they pump through the vents to keep delegates calm. It never works. It only makes the fear smell like flowers. I had my station along the eastern wall where the recorders sit. From there I could see the whole floor. The 9 high seats arranged in their crescent, each one raised, each one carved from a different world stone so that no single planet could claim the center. Below them, the petitioner's ring, where lesser species came to beg or bargain. And around all of it, the gallery, packed that day because word had gotten out. Everyone knew the Vroon delegation was coming, and everyone knew they were bringing a human. You have to understand what that meant back then. Humans were new, barely 80 years off their own rock, still smelling of the mud they'd crawled out of, as the saying went. Most of the great species had never seen one in person. The stories were all second-hand, all contradictory. Some said they were fragile, some said they were mad. The council had voted twice on whether to even admit Earth to observer status, and both times the vote had been no, and both times it had been close enough to make the powerful nervous. So when Ambassador Thrain of the Vroon requested a full session, and listed among his party a single human attaché, the gallery filled early. I remember the doors opening. The Vroon came first, of course. They are a tall people, elegant, all long limbs and that skin that shifts color with their mood. Thrain was flushed pale gold, which for a Vroon means confidence. His retinue flowed in behind him, a dozen advisors in their layered robes, and then the human. I will be honest, my first thought was, is that all? He was small. Not small for a human, I learned later, but small next to the Vroon who towered over him by a full head. He wore gray, a simple, close-cut uniform with no ornament, no rank markings I could read, no ceremonial weapon. His hair was dark and short. His face was, I struggled with human faces then, we all did, but his face was still. That is the word that comes back to me. Still. He walked 3 paces behind Thrain and to the right, and he did not look at the high seats, and he did not look at the gallery, and he did not look at the great windows or the lightning or the recorders. He looked at the room, all of it constantly, in a slow sweep that never stopped and never hurried. I did not understand what I was seeing then. I understand it now. He was the only person in that entire hall who was working. Everyone else had come to perform. He had come to watch. They took their places in the petitioner's ring. Thrain at the speaking stone, his retinue arranged behind him, and the human at the very back near the wall, hands folded in front of him, feet slightly apart. He did not sit. There were seats. He did not take one. High Counselor Marith opened the session. You would not have known her if you saw her, but everyone in that hall knew her the way you know a weather pattern that has ruined your harvests before. Marith of the Sethid, third of her line to hold the center seat, and the most powerful being in that room by a margin that made the margin itself seem rude. When she spoke, the vents stopped their whispering. When she was displeased, delegations went home to find their trade routes rerouted, their subsidies gone, their names quietly removed from lists that mattered. She looked down at Thrain, then she looked past him at the human, and she smiled, which for a Sethid involves showing a great many teeth. Ambassador Thrain, she said, the Concordance welcomes the Vroon. We note your delegation is complete. A pause exactly long enough to be an insult. "You have brought a pet." The gallery laughed, not all of them, but enough. I watched the human. He did not react, not a twitch. He kept watching the room, and I remember thinking that either he had not understood, or he had understood so completely that the insult had simply passed through him like light through glass. Thrain's skin flickered, a ripple of darker gold, irritation quickly mastered. "High Counselor," he said, "the attaché is a member of my protective detail, provided by Earth as a gesture of the goodwill between our peoples." "Goodwill," Marith repeated, as though tasting something spoiled. "The Vroon accept protection from a species that discovered fire while my grandmother was still deciding policy. How touching." More teeth. "Tell me, little Earth thing, do you understand these words, or do you only respond to your handler's tones?" She was speaking to the human directly now. The whole hall turned. He answered her. His voice was quiet, level. It carried anyway in the way that some quiet voices do, filling the space instead of fighting it. "I understand you fine," he said. That was all. No title, no trembling, no plea. He did not even unfold his hands. I have replayed that moment 10,000 times in the years since, and I still do not think Marith realized what had just happened. She had spent her whole life measuring power by how creatures reacted to her. The ones who groveled were weak and useful. The ones who postured were dangerous and had to be broken. But this one had simply answered a question, the way you answer any question, and then gone back to watching the room. He had filed her under understood and moved on. She was not used to being moved on from. Her smile sharpened. "It speaks, and so plainly, no respect at all. Perhaps that is a mercy. I would hate to be lied to by something that cannot possibly comprehend what it faces here." "Counselor," Thrain said, a warning note now, "we have come to discuss the Kellen Passage tariffs, not my staff. We will discuss what I decide we discuss." She did not even look at him when she said it. That was the thing about Marith. She could make you disappear inside your own petition. "Your staff interests me, Ambassador, or rather, what it represents." The galaxy grows crowded with young species who mistake noise for standing. Earth chief among them. 80 years, and already they send their soldiers to walk our halls. She leaned forward. "I wonder if it even is a soldier. Look at it. It carries no weapon. It wears no honors. On my world, the lowest servant of the salt mines wears more than that." I looked at the human again. He had shifted his attention to the high seats now, not to Marith, but to the entrances behind and below them. The service doors. The places a threat would come from. He was not listening to the insults at all. He was mapping exits. There is a thing I have learned about truly dangerous people, and I learned it that day. They do not argue about whether they are dangerous. The argument bores them. They are too busy watching the doors. The session ground on. Marith toyed with Thrain the way a predator toys with something already caught, letting him make his case on the tariffs, then dismantling it not with counterargument but with contempt, returning again and again to the human, as a way of reminding the entire hall that the Vroon had lowered themselves to consort with mud crawlers. It was cruel and it was effective, and around the gallery I saw the other delegations taking careful note. This is what happens, the lesson went, when you associate with the weak. You become a joke by proximity. And through all of it, the man in gray stood at the back and watched the room and said nothing and asked for nothing, and I will admit it, I began to feel a kind of second-hand shame on his behalf. Do something, I wanted to tell him. Defend yourself. Defend your people. They are making you small in front of the whole concordance and you are letting them. I understood nothing. I was a recorder. I thought the battle was the words. It was during the third hour that it changed. There was a commotion at the western entrance. One of the service doors, the very ones the human had been watching, opened out of sequence. A figure came through fast, moving wrong, moving with the particular ugliness of someone who has decided that this is the day they stop caring what happens to them. I did not recognize him at first. Later I learned his name was Corvin, a minor functionary from the Halish provinces, whose homeworld had been on the losing end of one of Mareth's trade decisions. A decision that had, the records would show, quietly starved several 100,000 people while the councillor adjusted a percentage. He had lost his family. He had lost his standing. And he had lost, somewhere along the way, the thing inside a person that tells them to stop. He had a device in his hand. Hellish work, crude but real, the kind of thing you build in a basement when the proper channels have all been closed to you. I did not know what it was. Most of the hall did not know what it was. The human knew. I want to be precise about the order of things because it matters, and because when people tell this story now they always get it wrong. They say the human leapt. They say he shouted a warning. They make it loud and grand. It was not loud. It was not grand. It was fast and it was quiet, and it was the most terrible thing I have ever seen a living creature do. Corvin came through the door and raised the device, and Mareth had time to do exactly nothing. She was still mid-sentence, still wearing her contempt like a crown, and in the space between one of her words and the next, the man in gray was simply no longer at the back of the room. I did not see him cross the floor. I have gone over my own recording 1,000 times, and there are frames where he is by the wall and frames where he is at the center and almost nothing in between. He moved like water finds a crack, not toward Corvin. That is what nobody understands. He did not move toward the threat. He moved to put himself between the threat and Thrain, between the device and his own ambassador, the one person in that room he was actually there to protect. Not Mareth, who had spent 3 hours calling him a pet, not the council, his principal. He crossed 30 feet of open floor in the time it takes to gasp, and he did not draw a weapon because he did not have one, and he put his own body flat against the space where the danger was going, and he got one hand up and the device went off. I will tell you what happens next in part 2, because I need to tell it properly, and I cannot do it quickly. What I saw in the next 4 seconds rearranged everything I believed about strength, about worth, about which species in this old and arrogant galaxy had actually understood what it means to stand between something you love and the dark. But I will leave you with this before I go on. When the light cleared and the screaming started, and the great and powerful of the Concordants were still frozen in their high seats with their mouths open, the man in gray was still standing, hurt, bleeding a color none of us recognized, but standing. And the first thing he did, before he checked his own body, before he acknowledged the pain that must have been immense, was turn his head toward his ambassador and ask, in that same quiet level voice, "You good?" 2 words, not to the council, not to the room that had mocked him, to the one person he had come to keep alive. That was the moment the Hall of 9 Waters went silent. And that was the moment, though none of them would say it yet, that the council began to understand exactly what they had let walk through their doors. Let me take you back into that room, because I stopped at the worst possible place, and I did it on purpose, and I am sorry. You good? 2 words hanging in the smoke. The device had gone off. I need to describe what that was like, because the words "went off" are too small for it. Hellish disruptors are not clean weapons. They do not punch a hole and leave. They tear at the space around a target, unstitch it, and for a fraction of a second the air in the center of the Hall of 9 Waters became something that should not exist, a knot of screaming light and wrongness where a Vroon ambassador had been standing. Except the ambassador was not standing there anymore, because the man in gray had moved him. I saw it in the recording afterward, slowed down until each frame was its own small eternity. In the instant before the device fired, the human's free hand, the one that wasn't rising toward the threat, had closed on Thrain's robe at the shoulder and pulled. Not gently. There is no gentle way to do it. He yanked a creature a full head taller than himself off his feet and down, using his own dropping weight as the anchor, and he put his body into the space that opened up, the space where the light was going. He took it across the back and the left side. I learned later from the physicians who tried to understand him that a Vroon caught in that cone would have come apart, Their bodies are elegant, but they are not built to argue with unmade space. The human's body argued. It should not have one. Everything we knew about humans said they were fragile, soft, a young and breakable people. Everything we knew was gathered second-hand from creatures who had never watched one decide to stand still, while the dark came for someone else. He was hurt, badly. The color coming out of him was red. I know that now, I did not know it then, and the wrongness of it, a color none of the great species bleed, made it somehow worse. His gray uniform was dark and wet down one side. He had come up from that crouch already turning, already scanning, and the first sound out of him was not pain. It was a question for Thrain. "You good?" The Vroon, sprawled on the floor of the petitioner's ring where the human had thrown him, made a sound I had never heard a Vroon make. Later I would understand it was simply the noise of a person realizing they are alive when they had already finished being afraid. And then, because a good guard does not stop at one, the man in gray turned toward the threat. Corvin was still there. The disruptor was single-use, spent, smoking in his hand, but Corvin did not know that, or did not care, and he was reaching into his robe for something else, and his face was the face of a person who has nothing left to lose and has therefore become the most dangerous thing in any room. The human crossed to him, bleeding, favoring his whole left side. He crossed the floor a second time, slower now, and everyone in that hall who had laughed 3 hours ago sat frozen in their high seats and watched a wounded mud crawler walk toward an armed and desperate killer with nothing in his hands at all. I thought he would strike. I braced for it. In the stories they tell now, this is the part where the human is a weapon, where he breaks Corvin, where the violence comes roaring out. It did not come. He reached Corvin and he did not hit him. He got one hand on the killer's wrist, the hand going for the second weapon, and he held it. Just held it immovable, while with his other hand he did the strangest thing. He put it flat against Corvin's chest. Not a blow, a pressure, a steadying. And he spoke to him, low so that only Corvin and the nearest recorders could hear, and I was near enough, and I have never forgotten it. "I know," the human said. "I know, whatever they did, I believe you," a breath. "But not like this, not you like this, put it down." Corvin was shaking. The whole hall could see it. This creature who had walked in ready to die, ready to take the most powerful being in the concordance with him, and the human was not fighting him. He was talking him down, bleeding his strange red blood onto the sacred floor, and using what strength he had left not to break a broken man but to hold him together long enough to stop. "They killed everyone," Corvin said, his voice cracked open. "They killed everyone and they smiled." "I saw the smile," the human said. "I've been standing here watching it for 3 hours. A pause. You think I don't know what she is?" And that quiet admission from the guard the counselor had called a pet did something to Corvin that no weapon could have. The killer's arm went slack. The second device, some ugly little thing, clattered to the floor, and Corvin folded all at once, the way people do when the thing that was holding them upright turns out to have been rage, and the rage runs out. The human caught him. Of course he did. Wounded as he was, he caught the falling weight of the man who had come to kill, and he lowered him to the ground with a care that made no sense, that fit nothing we understood about strength, and he knelt there beside him with one hand still flat on his chest until the security detail finally, unfroze and came pounding across the floor. Only then did the human let himself be hurt. I watched it happen. I watched the stillness that had held him upright let go, and he sat down hard on the stone beside the man he had just saved the galaxy from, and he pressed his own hand against his own bleeding side, and he breathed, and for the first time all day he closed his eyes. The Hall of Nine Waters was silent. I have been present for many silences in that room. The silence of a delegation destroyed. The silence before a vote that will end a people. But I had never heard a silence like that one. It was the silence of several hundred of the most powerful beings in known space, all understanding, at the same terrible moment, that they had spent 3 hours mocking the only person present who had turned out to matter. High Counselor Marith had not moved. She sat in her center seat, carved from the stone of 9 worlds, and she looked down at the human on the floor, and for once, for the only time I ever witnessed, Marith of the Sethid had nothing to say. It was Thrain who broke it. The ambassador got to his feet unsteady, his skin gone a color I had never seen on a Vroon, a deep and mottled bruise dark that I later learned means grief and gratitude tangled together past separating. He did not go to his seat. He went to the human. He knelt, an ambassador of the Vroon, kneeling on the petitioner's floor, beside a bleeding earth thing, and he took the human's red-wet hand in both of his long, pale ones. "You are hurt," Thrain said. "I've had worse," the human said, which I did not believe then and do not believe now, but it was, I have come to learn, a very human thing to say. "Why?" Thrain said, and it was not really a question about the tactics. We all understood that. "Why would you? They called you the whole session, they." "That's not my job," the human said. Thrain waited. "My job's you," the human said. "What she calls me doesn't change my job." I wrote that down. I wrote it down in the moment, my hands shaking, because I knew even then that it was the most important thing said in that hall in 400 years. What she calls me doesn't change my job. Every species in that gallery had spent its entire history measuring worth by what others called you. Standing, rank, honors, the color of your seat's stone. And here was a creature 80 years off his rock who had simply decided that none of it touched him. That his worth was a thing he carried inside, defined by what he did and who he stood for, and that no amount of contempt from the center seat could add to it or take it away. They had called him small all day, and it turned out he was the only one in the room who could not be made small, because he had never agreed to be measured by their ruler in the first place. The physicians came. They did not know how to treat him. No one had ever needed to treat a human in that hall, and I watched them hesitate, and I watched the man in gray, bleeding, talk them through it. Calm, precise, pressure here, don't move that, I need it flat, not tight. Managing his own emergency the way he'd managed everything else, because the stillness I had mistaken for weakness at the start of the day was not weakness at all. It was training so deep it had become a kind of peace. They carried him out on a float litter, and as they did, something happened that I have never seen before or since in the Hall of 9 Waters. The gallery stood. Not on command, not by protocol, there is no protocol for it, but as the human passed beneath them, bleeding and quiet on his litter, the delegations of the great species began to rise, section by section, the way a wind moves through a field. The Hallish stood. The Vroon stood. The Kellen and the Osso and the salt-born Sethid delegations who answered to Marith herself, they stood. Hundreds of beings who 3 hours earlier had laughed at a pet, rising to their feet in silence as a wounded human was carried past. And the human, drifting by on his litter, half-conscious, looked up at all of them standing. And I swear to you, I was close enough to see it. He seemed confused, as though he could not understand why they were making a fuss, as though what he had done was simply the thing you do, the obvious thing, the only thing, and their astonishment astonished him. That, more than anything, was the moment the council learned what he was from Earth. Not from any speech, not from any revelation of secret power, but from the simple, baffling fact that a being could do what he had done, cross a killing floor twice, take a disruptor across his own back to save another, talk a murderer down with mercy instead of breaking him, and then genuinely fail to understand why anyone would stand for it. Because on Earth, I would learn, they have a great deal of practice at this, at ordinary people standing between the dark and the ones they've sworn to keep. It is not extraordinary to them. It is only Tuesday, and that ordinariness, that terrible casual competence at sacrifice, was the most alien thing the Concordance had ever encountered. He lived. I should tell you that plainly, because you have been carrying it. He lived. The physicians learned human anatomy in a hard hurry, and the man in gray came through it. and I am told he was back on his feet and back at his post within a span that horrified his doctors and surprised no one who had watched him work. But the hall did not go back to what it was. The session on the Kellen Passage tariffs was suspended. When it reconvened, weeks later, Ambassador Thrain came again, and his human attaché stood again at the back of the petitioner's ring, in his gray uniform with no honors on it, watching the doors. And High Counselor Marith looked down from her center seat at the two of them. She did not smile with her many teeth. "Ambassador Thrain," she said, and then she stopped, and the whole hall waited because everyone remembered, everyone had heard, and everyone wanted to know what the most powerful being in the Concordance would do now. Marith of the Sethid looked at the man in gray, and she inclined her head. It was small. If you had not been watching for it, you might have missed it. But I was the recorder, and it was my task to miss nothing, and I saw the center seat of the Third Concordance bow its head 1 degree toward a human guard who wore no rank at all. An acknowledgement. From her, it was an earthquake. "Attaché," she said, "the Concordance sees you." The Concordance sees you. The oldest formula of recognition in our law, spoken to emperors and warlords and the founders of worlds. She spoke it to a soldier in gray. And the human, of course, simply nodded back, the small nod of a person acknowledging another person, and returned his attention to the doors. Because that was his job, and what she called him had never changed his job. I have kept the records of the Third Concordance for a long time. I have written down the fall of stars and the deaths of peoples and the slow grinding business of a galaxy pretending to be civilized. And of all the things I have set down, this is the one I return to. We thought strength was the size of your fleet. We thought worth was the stone of your seat. We measured every species that came before us by how loudly it could threat and how deeply it could grovel. And we had grown so old and so certain that we no longer noticed we were measuring the wrong thing entirely. Then a small, quiet man in gray walked in and let us mock him for 3 hours and crossed a killing floor to stand between the dark and someone he'd sworn to keep. And he did not do it to prove anything. That is what undid us. He did not do it for standing or honor or the color of a seat. He did it because it was his job, and because on the world he came from, that is simply what you do when the moment comes and you are the one standing closest. We called him a pet. We called him small. We called him a mudcrawler 80 years off his rock. He never argued. He was too busy watching the doors. And in the end, the whole Concordance rose to its feet for him, not because he was strong, though he was, but because he had shown us the one thing all our power had never taught us. That the measure of a person is not what they can destroy, but what they will stand in front of. They asked him once in the years after why humans were like this, why they threw themselves between the danger and the ones behind them, again and again, ordinary people with no honors on their coats. I am told he thought about it for a while, and then he shrugged in that human way and gave the only answer he ever gave. "Somebody has to stand there," he said. "Might as well be me." That is the whole of it. That is what the Council learned the day they mocked the alien diplomat's human guard. They learned that the galaxy had grown old, measuring the wrong thing. And they learned it from Earth.